Hi everyone, I'm Joshua Schmidt with the MLTI Ambassador team here at the Maine Department of Education. Over the last 3 weeks, we've looked at strategies for increasing student engagement in the classroom. Last week, we specifically looked at classroom discussions as a means to increase student engagement. We're going to continue that conversation this week, but we're going to look at ways to make those increased classroom discussions even more valuable. If you're interested in any tips or strategies, or just looking for a thinking partner on how to implement these tools into your classroom, please reach out to myself or another member of the MLTI Ambassador team. Down in the description, you're going to see links to other videos in this series, along with the slide deck for this video and a link for contact hours for anyone who needs them. While the majority of this video is going to be a discussion between Kate, Jonathan, and myself on how they use classroom discussions and make them more valuable in their classroom, I also wanted to provide some resources for people who are looking to implement these strategies. On the left is the video I did last week on increasing classroom discussions. Lots of resources were involved in that video. In the middle is the MLTI YouTube channel, where there are tons of video resources that have contact hours attached to them for any teacher who's interested. And on the right is my Hi Hello card that you can scan with that QR code, or you can reach out to an ambassador directly if you had a question. In this video, you're going to see Jonathan, Kate, and myself. And all of our emails are right there for you if you had questions. At the bottom is the bit.ly link to this presentation. There's also a PDF version down in the description. You're going to be hearing these terms a lot, and I brought this up in the last video, but I really wanted to quickly discuss it here just to make sure everyone understands the terms. When we have synchronous and asynchronous learning, the difference there would be the time frame that the learning is taking place. Synchronous learning meaning that the content is happening all at the same time and usually in the same way. And asynchronous learning would be different content in different time frames. You can also think of discussions in the same way. A synchronous discussion would be happening all at once together, and an asynchronous discussion would be happening in different time frames. Synchronous discussions can be online or in person, but in most cases, a synchronous discussion happens in person and an asynchronous discussion happens online, but they don't have to work that way. Welcome, everybody. We're here for our interview that's talking about ways to increase the value of classroom discussions and how that's kind of evolved over time. I'm very excited to be joined by two MLTI ambassadors who have some expertise in this subject and can share that with us today. So I want to dive right in. I'd like you two to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit more about your expertise with this topic. And we'll start with Kate.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for having us today. My name is Kate Meyer, and I am an English teacher and a design thinking teacher at Mount Desert Island High School in Bar Harbor. I've been teaching English for 22 years now, and so it's kind of a natural expertise in classroom-based discussions, especially because all of my training in my undergraduate work, my graduate work, and then also in my student teaching work was all discussion-based training. So that's the model that I have just carried naturally into my own classroom. And so my classroom is typically a discussion-based classroom.
And I'm Jonathan Warner, also a senior second-year ambassador. When I am not working for the Department of Education, I am the tech integrator at Cape Elizabeth Middle School. I started teaching English in 1996. And taught for several years. And then, as my friend said, I made the critical vocational error of going to law school and found my way back to the fold in 2011, where I taught English again and some social studies, and moved into tech integration after about another 5 years. So my expertise is in those areas. Like Kate, my own training and my own classroom experience as a student had tons of discussion in it. But what I don't have as much expertise in, and I'll reference a little bit, is how discussion takes place in STEAM classrooms. And despite being a huge advocate for it, I think writing across the curriculum, writing in math classes as an example is phenomenal. Discussion in math classes, it can be a little easier in science, I think, and there may be more examples of it, but I just want to sort of carve out that area of lesser expertise with some resources that I think we've shared with Josh to share with you all about places you might look for support in that area.
Well, thank you both again for being here. I'm really excited to see how your progression as educators has kind of evolved over time, because something, and Jonathan and I talked a little bit last week about how to just increase discussion across the board in your classrooms. And today it's kind of looking at how your expertise allows us to make those discussions even more valuable, because just like what Jonathan said, that you kind of have your lanes of expertise, but it can be challenging to see exactly how that fits within, the general structure. So kind of starting out here, I just want to hear kind of how that instruction utilizing classroom discussion has evolved over time, kind of where you started and kind of where you've progressed over time. And we'll start with Jonathan on this one.
So Kate and I talking about this before we began recording, realized that there's a slight difference in the years we started teaching, and that difference was really significant. So we thought I would talk first just because my experience preceded hers as a teacher by just a few years. So in '96, there was no educational technology for me easily accessible. We had one computer lab, and it was not one we could easily reserve. I was teaching down in Pennsylvania, and we had a very large high school with amazing resources, but not a lot at that time with tech. So my first mistake was I thought discussions ran themselves, and all the magic that had happened when I was a student in the classroom, all you had to do is ask good questions, like, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. What do you all think? And they're like, what the heck are you talking about, Mr. Werner? So there was the first evolution of like, oh, there is work to do to help you have productive conversations, because if I quote lines of poetry, you're unlikely to have a lot to say out of the box. Then I started doing some preparation, really like analog, like double entry journals, Cornell notes, where I would talk about, fact-based things or things that we needed to cover, and then ask them to reflect. We did a lot of peer editing. Kate and I were remembering the days, makes me feel so old, but it was true, of putting the overhead up with a student's passage that they had, like an example of their writing. They had agreed to allow us to have group edit, and we would like mark it up with our, dry erase markers on the overhead machine. And so that period of time was really tech free. And it didn't even occur to me really to use tech beyond writing. Of course, my students were writing papers on their own machines. But the idea of integrating tech into discussion was not on my radar screen. I think it's notable that when I now think about the tools that I favor for enhancing conversation, they actually replicate aspects of what I just described. That is reflective thinking, shared work, peer editing, preparation before the discussion actually begins, really thinking about how you frame your questions. So even though the tech augments that, it is not substantively different in terms of its purpose in getting them to think differently or in deeper ways about the subject that we're going to discuss. So then I stepped away for 10 years, as I said, 1999 to, or a little longer, 2011. And when I came back, now tech was all around me. And so I had to catch up and be like, whoa, all right, I need to figure out how this is going to work. And so that second curve, I'll talk more about as we progress sort of towards some of these other questions about tools. But as I began integrating, I realized that even I, who had been away from it, had more comfort level than many of my colleagues. And actually my journey to becoming a tech integrator was the growing realization that I could really see the benefits. I could really imagine how tech enhanced learning was going to be really powerful for students in ways that we'll talk about in a minute, but that it was so clear to me that it would be an equalizer, that it would offer opportunities it hadn't offered, that I felt like not doing it was a disservice. And in the culture I was in at the time, people were like, I don't understand why you think this is important. This is an English class. Oh, okay. So we have a fundamental difference. And that really spurred me to want to almost like proselytize and be like, friends, listen here. Technology can change us. And with the one caveat that I often surprise people by responding with, I'm not sure there's a tech tool that's the best response to that question. I'm not sure that tech will enhance that discussion or that conversation. I'm not sure that the way to go here is tech integration. And they're often sort of put back on their heels. But like Kate, I teach design thinking, and amazing stuff comes out of analog work in design thinking. So with that kind of core value, I'll just offer the caveat, and I'll suggest a couple of places where comes up, but it isn't always ed tech that amplifies the conversations. And there are ways in which those first series of techniques pre-tech that I described remain often the best option for my students and the teachers I work with. And my final small point is that from 2015 forward, I have not had my own classrooms. I've only been dropped into other classrooms. So in the last several years, what I'll be talking about as my expertise has to do with my observation of my colleagues in CAPE, both at the middle school and the high school. So I will carve out another sort of reservation to say neither Kate nor I has elementary experience, and there are incredible resources for that as well, but they're not ones that are in our shared experience.
Great. So like Jonathan mentioned, our teaching careers began a few years. We have a few years difference in between the two of us. So I started teaching in 2000, but just like Jonathan mentioned, I did not have tech augmented options at the beginning of my career either. We were still 3 or 4 years out from having something that was seamless and smooth. And so that hasn't really been anything that I've integrated into discussions until we started doing hybrid teaching. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about asynchronous discussions. My classroom based discussions have always been very, as Jonathan said, analog, because I like putting away the tech for moments too, to be able to have those face-to-face conversations. So I know when it happened. I was gifted very early on in my career with a few years of students who were really engaging in the text I was asking them to read, and then would do the reading and then would come back and have a lot to say. So that was a gift for me because I didn't have a struggle getting discussions started at the beginning of my career because I was just gifted these students who did it really naturally. They had been trained well by their teachers who came before me. So I just remember very specifically 5 or 6 years into my career, I am standing at the board. I am doing the old, Great Gatsby classroom conversation. And I draw out a map and I'm annotating it and I'm super excited and I'm drawing little characters and houses. And I'm doing the same thing that Jonathan mentioned, which was I'm super excited about this text. Tell me what you think. And it was like crickets. And nobody had anything to tell me. I think partially because they were suspecting that I was looking for an answer, that I had an answer, and that they were to guess what my answer was, which of course was not the case. I really was curious to know what they thought, but it became a roadblock for them because they thought, that I was seeking the right answer, and I wasn't. And so it became at that point me standing in front of my classroom having a conversation with myself about the Great Gatsby. And that is how the rest of that book played out. And I just remember being so uncomfortable and I could not figure out what was happening. Why was nobody talking to me, or maybe 1 or 2 students would kind of chime in, and I was able to, have a back and forth for 45 seconds or so with those students, and everyone else just kind of listened. And then it was really just back to me talking about how much I love the Great Gatsby, right? And so it didn't really feel like the direction that I wanted to go into. And so at that point, I then discovered a book called Making Thinking Visible. And it is a book filled with discussion protocols. And so I grabbed onto those immediately and started, typing those protocols up into Google Docs and sharing those with my students. So then I would put them in small groups and we would do a protocol for discussion. And of course it's a protocol. So it's very, step 1, you do this, step 2, you do this, step 3, you do this. But I realized that that's what they needed because they just didn't know how to engage in a conversation. So one of my favorite protocols, and the one that I find works with all of the grade levels I've worked with, 9 through 12, and all ability levels and willingness levels. There's one called Save the Last Word. And so that is where the student ahead of time has chosen a quote or a passage from reading. They read it aloud to their group without any comment. And then basically you go around the group and everybody comments on why that passage or line or quote or whatever it is significant. So I bring it to the table, I just read it out loud, everybody else talks about why it's significant, and then I, as the person who brought the passage to the table, I have the last word as to why I thought that was significant. And not part of the protocol, but it always happens, is when it comes back to me and I say, oh, here's why I thought it was significant, a little discussion starts. You know, just kind of like this natural little organic discussion, and then they move on to the next person. And so that's where I start every year when I'm, you know, when I've got new students in front of me who I am scaffolding up discussion practice around. Then we take, so we do 3 or 4 different protocols, we repeat them over and over and over, and then we go into book clubs. So my students are now in small groups of 4 or 5 students generally, reading a text that they have selected in common. So every group is reading something different, and I teach them how to write discussion questions. So I do a lot of question stems. So here's what a good discussion question looks like. So they start writing their own discussion questions, preparing their notes from their texts ahead of time. And then in their book club groups, on the days that we're having discussions, they run those discussions in their groups. So small groups, low stakes. I'm just moving around, listening, coaching. You know, sometimes I jump in if they're talking about something that I get really excited about. I try not to. And they kind of work themselves through those book club groups. Then we move, so we're about halfway through the course now, to full class. We call them round tables. So we literally put our desks in a circle. I actually remove myself from that circle because I tell them my goal is by the end of the course that you don't need me anymore, that you could come in and set up your desks and go with a discussion and have a really rich discussion. So I simply sit back. I observe the process. I do a lot of process observations for them, and I track who says what kind of questions are asking. Are they prompting others who haven't spoken to speak? So I do a lot of tracking and process observation. So after we do the first one, I share what I've observed with them. So I'll say, oh, I noticed that you all kind of talked over each other a little bit, so we need to solve that problem. Or 5 people didn't speak and the other 15 of you just kind of let that go, right? So what do we do about that when 5 people aren't speaking? And as a class, we solve the problems together. They tell me what's going to happen next time when someone's not speaking. Does that person give you a code that they don't want to speak at all? Do you call on them by name and ask them, hey, so-and-so, what do you think? Like, I let them problem solve that all out. And then we run the next round table. And that's where I say, remember, we're going to try out these things that you identified as needs. And this is what you said you wanted to do about that. So let's try that out. And then I process observe again. So I'm giving them kind of constant feedback. And we, by the end of the course, probably have 6 big whole class roundtables where I am an observer, and that process recorder and reflector back to them. And it generally only takes 2 roundtables before I can step back completely. I don't have to even do any prompting of anything, and they really are running those discussions. And that really, for me, is the whole entire goal. So that is that's the evolution of, Ms. Meyer talking about the Great Gatsby by herself to, my classes at all grade levels running discussions without me.
I was going to amplify 2 things you said, Kate, that really struck me. One is that you gave the name to what I realized but I didn't say, which is scaffolding the skills, and that the equivalent of a cold call, when you're like, so kids, what's your thinking? I cannot count the number of times I did exactly what you did, where I was like, Hamlet, look at Elsinore, blah, 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 blah. And they turn around, they're like, super. That was fun. And no amount of like humor or like, good-naturedness brings it out of them. And Josh and I talked last time, there's places for lecture, right? Like you need to bring them up to speed on Shakespeare or about, Denmark so that the context makes sense. Great. But then somehow I thought that would naturally emerge, and it didn't, as you said. So scaffolding. And the second is something we haven't talked about, but I think is hit me really hard as you were talking. The SAMR model, which talks about substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. You described, or you mentioned, Google Docs. And I think there is an unfair, derisive quality where people are like, oh, you're just substituting and augmenting. And that's exactly what you did with Google Docs, to huge positive effect. And I think just to sort of name for people, there is no shame. There's no shame, friends, in using substitution and augmentation. You don't have to modify and redefine every time. There are amazing ways where that's possible, and we'll talk about some of those today. But that initial step, holy cow, what changed when I could do collaborative writing in a Google Doc, right? And do that peer editing, give out 6 copies for 6 people to edit, and then pull all those edits together. It was game changing. And I guess it was sort of modification, but it was more like, augmentation. And I think it took me a while to sort of put down the burden that that was not enough. If I was going to be an advocate for ed tech integration, I always had to be changing the world with tech. So that just jumped out from what you said, and I thought worth flagging.
Well, and something that you had brought up, Jonathan, was the idea that, like, I'm not sure that tech is always the answer. Makes it really clear that if you're choosing to use a technology, it should be strictly better than whatever it is replacing or augmenting in that situation. And it was very cool to see how both of you're kind of in that like tech revolution point where so many things have become available and teachers have kind of thought that it's new, so we have to use it. So I'm really curious though, like one of the things that's happened recently is kind of this shift towards discussions being asynchronous, whether that's, by the nature of the pandemic or just simply by the value of the tools that were provided. So I'm wondering about how has your asynchronous discussions evolved over time as well? And have those evolutions in that asynchronous format, have they impacted your synchronous, or have they interacted in any way back and forth? And we'll start with Kate on this one.
Sure. So like I said, probably again, 5 or 6 years into my career, Google Classroom started really developing out. And my school had been at that point a one-to-one laptop school for a few years now. So my classroom went paperless right away onto Google Classroom. I jumped right onto that. And when they started building in that ability to have threaded discussions, I just kind of started dabbling in that. Mostly, quite honestly, when I would have a substitute. So it was a great way for students to still hold a discussion about class-related topics, even if I was not there to be the one to guide or to listen. I wouldn't miss out on anything, and they could still move forward in class. So it became kind of my quick and easy subplans were asynchronous discussions on Google Classroom. And they're very what I would say kind of like old school threaded discussions. They were not fancy. They didn't do a whole lot. It allowed students to post a comment to a question and to see some responses and to respond to others. So it was pretty basic in terms of what it could do. But I just kind of dabbled with that for a while, and I didn't actually really fully come into kind of my own with asynchronous discussions until we started teaching in a hybrid situation a few years ago. But I was also at that same time, like right as we were, well, a little bit before we were going hybrid, and as we moved to hybrid, I was again like, kind of these challenges pop up, right? That you then need to solve. Like nobody's talking to me when I'm talking about the Great Gatsby. We have to solve that. Then I started, having classes of students coming in front of me who were quite introverted and didn't want to speak. And I would get students more and more often who had selective mutism, who then had a really hard time speaking. And I was charged as an English teacher with the task of assessing, speaking, and listening. And so, those roundtables, what had been working for me for quite a few years, suddenly weren't working quite as well. And there was more frustration from the students who were like, but I don't like to speak. I can't speak, whatever the situation might have been. And, at that point I was allowing, I was saying, well, if you don't want to speak, that's okay. Take notes on the conversation. And when someone poses a great question, write that question down and what your response would be. And that would give me a little bit, but it still wasn't quite speaking and listening, to the fullest extent. So then I realized really the introverts and students who are really uncomfortable speaking need space and time to plan and process what it is that they want to say. And so roundtable, full class roundtables weren't always my, the best go-to when I needed to assess speaking and listening. I needed to find alternatives that allowed everybody to showcase their skills. And so then hybrid teaching happened, and I was introduced to this. It was a very new platform at the time called Parlay. It's an online platform that allows teachers to host both synchronous and asynchronous discussions. So it will do both things. The synchronous discussions are really great because it allows the students, again, to run that fully themselves. But I really use the asynchronous discussion, which again is a threaded discussion on Parlay during remote teaching, which allowed for us to have conversations when we weren't anywhere near each other. And Parlay has done a really nice job building out from that kind of threaded discussion model, so students can post GIFs and memes and emojis and videos and links. I mean, they can post everything that they're finding online to support their answers. So they can have those threaded discussions. And it also gives the teacher an opportunity to allow for anonymity in those discussions. So if I click the, let the students remain anonymous button, I can see who they are, but they get assigned to these historical figures as their roles, basically, or as their, avatar. And they can hold discussions with each other, not knowing to whom they're speaking back and forth necessarily, which I didn't understand the power of it until I started using it with my juniors. And we did a couple of discussions that way. And I said, okay, so should I turn the anonymity off? And they were like, oh no, like, we love this. We all grew up together. We want to have discussions with people we don't know necessarily. So they're not formulating answers based on what they think their friends want to hear, based on who they think they're speaking to. So that was really cool for me. And Parlay allows for that, which is something, like Jonathan said, on the SAMR model, couldn't do in the classroom without that tech helping us. So I'm adopting this new platform. We're doing these anonymous discussions. And at the same time, the internet is blowing up with really awful, hateful conversations online. And I'm fully aware, because I'm being exposed to it, that my students are also being exposed to it. And so I began, how do we hold asynchronous discussions online? I started with, how do we hold civil conversations? What is a civil conversation? How do we agree and disagree with each other when we're anonymous online? How do we do that? And so I'll talk about this when we talk about tools, but I contacted Parlay and told them the issue that I was having, and they built a roundtable for me on that topic. So they gave me all the resources, the prompt, and I just had to assign it, and then kind of off we went. And that really started kind of my foray into Parlay, which really just has blown up conversations in my classroom. So we still do the roundtables, but now we also have this asynchronous option that does all of those things for my students.
In Parlay, is everything written, or do you have the option to also have audio feedback?
In the asynchronous discussions, everything is written.
And again, to use the exact same word to amplify something Kate said, she wrote to Parlay, and Parlay created for her what she needed. Wow. Like, there's not a lot of, we don't work for Parlay, but when Kate was telling me about some of the things she's posed to them and that they have pulled together and they package, it is priceless in terms of, and just they're pulling from resources you couldn't possibly know. And so you're getting just this incredible, she showed me some of the examples that I was really impressed with. Okay, so my awareness of the need for ways to hear other voices was actually earlier than Kate's. So actually the biggest awareness was the year before I left the classroom. So I was teaching American Studies in a double, like a wall removed double classroom, 50 students with another teacher. And we had about 25 boys and about 25 girls. And this is a huge generalization, but by and large, I had really loud guys who were showing off and really smart, quiet women who actually had something to say but weren't speaking. And as I told Kate at one point, one of my cooperating teachers gifted me the phrase, "About that which you know nothing, do not elaborate." I had many, many young men elaborating about that which they knew nothing. So what do I do to get these other voices? And what I employed was a blog, very straightforward. I didn't have any, this is 2014 or so. I didn't have a really robust tool out there that I was aware of, at least. And all I would do is the night before post the questions, which I'd given a lot more thought to than tell me your thoughts on Emily Dickinson's first line. But now I said, I would like your response. And then once people start responding, I would like you to respond to 2 other people. And we definitely had to have the conversations about respectful. In my case, not being anonymous was helpful because it kept people accountable. And I didn't have a tool that anonymized names, but allowed me to still know who they were. We had to talk about not hijacking shared documents. We had to have the reveal of like, oh, let's look at revision history, Bobby, and see what in fact you did or didn't do. Not that I want to play gotcha, but sometimes it was really fun when they were being self-righteous. Love you, Bobby. So the sensibility of like getting those voices heard, and it was like night and day. Once this happened, and I think it was a combination of things, that age, but the huge class or comparatively huge class, lots of new content, and it was double social studies and English. So they were wrestling with like all these interchanges between those 2 subjects. And being an American Studies major in college, I was all in, but I increasingly realized that like I wasn't asking literary or history questions most of the time. And certainly when we were with the wall down, we were asking really complicated kind of interdisciplinary questions. So young women start responding in volumes, like, you'd come in, there'd be like 30 lines of small print text and responding to something in a blog. Then I could say, Stephanie, you had a great point last night in your observations about this. Would you share it with us here? And there was that stepping stone, again, that scaffolding was an entree into totally transforming the classroom discussion. And my colleague was dead set against this. He, in fact, was telling me that I was abdicating my role of teaching by moving some of the discussion online. And that was a fascinating conversation to be having, because his perception was that I was trying to threaten the classroom discussion, which he had taught with for years and thought was invaluable. And only when he started seeing how the discussion changed, which he had been accustomed to happening over the course of the whole year, because he'd been teaching this class for 10, 12 years already. And this was my first year teaching it. That shift was not only in the students, but in him, and where I started to get the sense of like, oh, I might have something, and I might be able to present this in a way that people can hear and be able to adopt. It also made me remember that in one of the most sort of shocking, poignant, you never know what's happening in your classroom situations, I had a Vietnamese pair of fraternal twins, a young man and a young woman, and their receptive language was virtually perfect and their expressive language was not. And we were talking about the things they carried, and talk about a totally different perspective on that book than my young cherubs from Southern Maine. It was breathtaking the way that those voices could enter the conversation when they had the chance to think about it, check their dictionaries, write it. They would ask me, is what I'm saying, like in advance of posting something? And it was like, you could hear a pin drop in the conversations, because then I could say, student, would you tell us a little bit about what you said last night? And if there was some discomfort, I could read, I would check with them in advance. But sort of like the selective mutism, it honored this perspective that no one else in the room had, and which was never going to get heard if I said, so thoughts about the Vietnam War, right? What does he mean when he says sometimes the lies are truth and truth is lies? And like, their perspective was so invaluable, and it was the tech that allowed it to come out. So that's where modification, I would say, begins, and maybe even redefinition, because those kids' experience with that book, the 48 for whom Vietnam was not their childhood and who had not emigrated in the last 5 years, um, I could not have replaced with anything. There's no way I could have given that. So what I note, though, going back to what I said at the beginning, is that that wasn't that different than passing around 2-column notebooks, right? Or like asking students to annotate text the night before. And now that I'm in a school with a lot of iPads, Explain Everything has become a phenomenal tool for this. So many of my colleagues will send home a passage, and Explain Everything will accept audio commentary. So it can be totally respectful of people's various skills, right? And that it completely can level the playing field for a student in a special education track for whom writing is not comfort, but who has powerful, articulate ideas to share. Doing it in advance allows them to get feedback prior to speaking or writing. And so the confidence they have in what they're actually putting forth, it like puts in a stage before they actually have to speak and be heard. And for students who would like that, it's available. So you, in the way Explain Everything works, there's a cloud base, and the teacher can pop in and look at what's happening before it's made public, right? So there's a two-phase process. Here's the text, annotate it in whatever ways you like, or following these instructions, share it with me, teacher, and then the teacher will greenlight whether to share it or not out to the class. And those kinds of tools, just they are such gifts, and that's not the only one. We'll talk about some others. But if you think about it from the perspective of bringing voices to the table that would not be heard in a context where the loudest voice, the most aggressive voice, the most confident voice is the one that's going to speak, it is as powerful for the people who would otherwise be silenced as it is to watch some of those boys who I loved sit back on their heels and be like, ooh, maybe my perspective is not that important, or maybe I don't know everything about this. And to extend the conversation about the things they carried, there's a central female character whose experience would never have been the subject of the conversation in the way it was if those young men had continued to dominate the conversation. Whereas when it was effectively in that moment of a young women's conversation to which the men were adding, it was like one of the most rewarding teaching experiences of my life, that novel, which I already loved, but it was like, holy cow, what can happen if we get other people speaking that otherwise wouldn't have?
I think it's also fascinating to hear how, your classroom has evolved in terms of what tools you've used and for what reason. If someone would come observe your classroom today, they might think that that specific tool is the reason why you're getting the success with that specific conversation. So kind of as our last topic for today, I kind of want to extend that into a few more of the tools you've talked about. I know you both have referenced a few that really are valuable in your classroom now, but I also was curious about why you chose those tools, or what specific reasons a specific ed tech resource really jumps out to you as valuable for kind of extending the value of those conversations. And let's start with Jonathan on this.
Sure. To start with what you just said, Josh, I think the key for me in any tool selection is what is the goal, and then find the tool that fits it. Because there are like bells and whistles that I discover, and I'm like, oh, those are cool. But if you are, I will frequently have teachers say to me like, I want to use Nearpod. And my response is, Nearpod is phenomenal, but what do you want to do? And then let's talk about Nearpod. Can Nearpod do that or not? So Nearpod, phenomenal tool. If you're not familiar with it, it'll take, say, like a Google slideshow and give you all kinds of interactive experiences. And if we talk about that scaffolding up to a classroom conversation, it can be really, really great because you're presenting some information, they can respond, it can be Q&A, it can be narrative, it can be short answer. So that's one kind of tool where the goal being the engagement with the text and the engagement with the idea prior to trying to speak about it in the classroom is the kind of focus. Explain Everything offers that same opportunity. I was going to mention Flipgrid too, just because my daughter's a freshman in college, and her class, which is focused on education, has a summative assessment in one of the units that is in Flipgrid. And the rationale, so this professor is phenomenal in articulating why she's doing what she's doing, because it's an education class. So she said, some of you are going to be really uncomfortable with this. Others of you are going to want to, hug me, because you have come to this institution without the same skill set of writing that others have. And if I assume that you can write to best express your ideas, I'm going to miss some of your best ideas. And I thought that was like brilliant. And what a reason to use technology, right? Same concept here. Not that those people wouldn't have been heard necessarily, but their best ideas and their best expression wouldn't have been heard if the medium required writing. So I think Flipgrid can be great for that. Jamboard is another one, and Kate and I were talking about this. It doesn't necessarily work as a discussion tool per se, but what it does allow you to do is do some really great preparation. And one of the activities I've found is really successful is to assign a small group the conversation starter and leading for a particular unit or a particular day. And so I will have that group of students use a Jamboard to collaborate in their preparation for leading the conversation. Then they post the questions, they lead the conversation. Obviously, I'm monitoring to make sure that the work is following appropriate guidelines and things. But the tools you use, that I guess I would say to our listeners, reframe your thinking about what tools are doing for discussion. We don't mean they are allowing you to speak or allowing you to share ideas. We mean in the whole continuum from inception of like engaging with an idea to expressing it. There are a series of tools with different strengths and different sort of areas that get you ready to elevate the conversation and to just have a much better, more useful, I'll say, expenditure of your synchronous time. I'll finish by saying something as another example of nothing technological, but that occurred to me when Kate was saying you could, by the end of the year, have students run their own discussions. Several years ago, I was visiting a library as we were redesigning our learning commons, and the librarian said to me, almost every time class begins, when I have a direct instruction class in the library, I tell them what we're doing, and I say, rearrange the space to do what we're going to do today. And the message was, make your learning commons as physically flexible as possible so everything moves, which we fortunately were able to take in. And for those of you redesigning your classrooms or your libraries, there is no better advice than don't bolt anything to the floor. It's incredible. But what happens, except maybe the bookshelves so they don't tip over, but the sensibility of the pre-engagement in those first 90 seconds of getting ready for the discussion, I watched it happen repeatedly, and I've now suggested to people and watched it happen over and over. You start at a 7 instead of a 0 when they sit down. So there's this kind of passive, like, all right, instruct me, Ms. Meyer, versus like, I have already made the investment of knowing you're asking us to have small group discussions. We're doing book groups today, book club. So that's how this room needs to be. And they jump right in. And it's one of those moments where I don't know what tech tool there could possibly be that would do that, right? But this very simple idea of kinesthetic engagement is so transformative. So I would just encourage you, as you're listening to this, think to yourself all the ways, not the tech ways, not the written ways, not the like only in your brain ways, but all the ways you can get that first minute of the conversation to start at a 7. And if you're doing that, you're doing something totally transformative for your kids, because your students, it becomes, those conversations end at an 11. And that is somewhere that's almost impossible to get. And I never got to, instead of, cricket day, where you're like, I think Gatsby is really cool. You don't agree? Oh, well, all right. What about Fitzgerald? He had an interesting life, and you'd be like grasping at straws. But if you could get them starting with a conversation about like, Kate mentioned to me the other day a piece of literary criticism she read where Gatsby was passing So he had been a light-skinned African-American man passing throughout the whole novel. What if that's the story? And if you could get kids engaged at that level and ready to have that conversation, talk about like a lead balloon. If you opened up with like, so kids, let's talk today about whether Gatsby's passing. Oh, but you could have an incredible conversation about that if you've gotten them ready. So as you think about engaging students in discussion, think about every way you can do that. And if your gut says it isn't a tech tool, you're right. Like Kate and I, as the ambassadors of technology, gift you the confidence that that is the right answer. It is not technology, and that's great. And it's not redefinition, that's great. Like you are doing something different and transformative if what you're doing is getting them ready to really fully engage in whatever way that is.
I've used a lot of those tools that Jonathan has mentioned, and I'll add Padlet to that tool. And Josh is going to share a slide that I made last year as my first year as an MLTI ambassador on using Padlet for student engagement. Which again, kind of like Jonathan mentioned with Jamboard, it doesn't necessarily host a discussion, but it's a really great place for students to gather all of their thoughts electronically to go into a discussion. And it could host a discussion if you set it up to do that. But my one true love is Parlay. And it's because it just fits with me philosophically. Jonathan was saying, when you choose a tool, think about why. And so in my classroom, I'm always telling my students, I really believe that you are here with me to learn how to learn. And we do a lot of metacognition. Everything is based on, self-reflection and goal setting. And that just really runs my philosophy of education. One thing that Parlay does, it does a lot of things, but one thing that it does is that it becomes the process observer for asynchronous discussions. So when an asynchronous discussion is over, it generates data. So it will tell me, it generates data about participation responses. So I'm, 93% of your students submitted a response. 87% of your students gave at least one comment to others. 87% of students received at least one comment. It will tell us the average comment length. So the average comment length for this discussion was 87 words. It generates a keyword cloud. So it creates a word cloud. Again, like visuals so the students can see it. And it also creates, they call them now comment chords, but it's what some educators might call a Harkness chart. So it tracks, who was speaking, who was speaking to whom back and forth. Was it a back and forth? Was it a one-time question that never got answered? Like it tracks that visually. And then not only does it do that, but it also gives reflection questions. So it's going to generate data for me that I can show my students, a little graph. 87 words was your average comment length. And then it will ask them, why does the average word length of our peer comments and feedback matter? And I like to say, does it matter? So, right, I don't know. I'm not saying it does. So we have that conversation, like, does it matter? Because especially with like my honors kids, they think I need to put down all the words. So they will put down 10,000 words in a comment when it's not a writing assessment, it's a discussion, right? It will ask them, does the word count reflect the quality of the comment? And then it will ask, how can we improve our next one? And so for all of those 4 data points, it also gives me reflection questions to use with my students. So I will, after a discussion is closed, I will send them that data. I can screenshot that, send it to them. And the day after that discussion closes, we talk about those reflection questions as a way to prepare for our next asynchronous discussion. And in some classes, like my honors class, I run 1 asynchronous discussion a week. They open every Sunday, they close every Friday. So it's just kind of a routine that we get in, but again, it does that process piece. And again, I don't work for Parlay, call me. They have what they call the universe, which is a collection of roundtables to be used synchronously or asynchronously, of topics and prompts already built out. So it has every subject I think that you could think of: English, history, science, math, social studies, modern languages, philosophy, arts and culture. So it has all of those subjects already built out with roundtables in there that I can either use exactly as they are with all the multimedia and the prompts built right in, or I can edit them to add my own resources or take things out that maybe I don't think my students would, respond to. And also they have what they call their content concierge service. And so while Parlay is a freemium platform, educators can create a free account and you get 10 roundtables, 10 free, and you can delete the old ones. So you always can have 10 going. And if you have the paid version, you have unlimited. But both options offer this concierge service, which is where you click a little button right on your screen and a real person is chatting with you within a minute, and you let them know what it is that you're looking for, the goals of your lesson. You can have a little chat conversation back and forth, and within a day or two, they will have created a customized roundtable for you and your class that just gets like beamed right into your account. And I do that often. The science teachers in my building do that often. They say they've gotten, my science teachers especially are like, we've gotten resources like Jonathan said that like we didn't even know were out there. So Parlay curates these things for them and zaps it out as a roundtable. So there are just so many benefits to using this program. It also, like I said, will help students host their own synchronous discussions. So it creates kind of a little map of your classroom, and students can tag in electronically when they have something they'd like to say. And so they can call on each other. They can also click a button that says challenge. So like if I disagree with you, I can click the challenge button. And when it's my turn to talk, you know that I'm going to start with something like, I hear what you're saying, however, I disagree, and here's why. And it gives them those stems and really helps them have a face-to-face synchronous discussion as well. So it does everything that I need it to do, and also that metacognitive piece, which for me in my classroom is essential.
We didn't program this in, Josh, but I'm going to suggest a last word. So my last word is, look, I'm using an analog tool. So what I noticed and what Kate just described, Parlay, brilliant. I do hope they call you Kate. But the observation she made that you're teaching them not the content, and I guess I want to free you, listeners, from the belief that if it's not about Gatsby, it shouldn't be happening. I would say, who the heck cares what it's about? It could be about Schmatzby if it is about having civil discourse, if it's about improving the level of conversation. It occurs to me that I once watched a fishbowl, so where you have a group in the middle having the conversation and the people are on the outside watching that conversation, they can tag in. So another kind of protocol. The teacher was totally freaking out because the conversation had moved to being about how they were discussing, not the subject matter. And it wasn't my place, but I was like, oh my gosh, let it go, let it go. And she kept trying to be like, okay, but come back to Hamlet, whatever it was. And it struck me as like, if I could give anyone advice about this, it's, if you think about it this way, like Kate knows a ton about Gatsby, but she doesn't know everything about Gatsby. And it isn't Gatsby per se. It's about like heroic struggle, thinking about the arc of a narrative, thinking about symbolism. Like, can they take the skills that Gatsby happens to allow them to learn because Kate knows to teach them out into other places? And if you as the teacher are willing to let go a little bit from the sense that like what you need to share is, does everyone see the symbol of the green light at the end of the dock? To, do you conceptualize that symbols in literature have importance? Sorry, I can hear my alarm go off. If your sense is that your goal is to get them to elevate their capacity for dialogue, you are doing a gift to the country, to democracy, to like, to those kids. And you're letting go the hubris that you know what's best. Instead saying like, these skills and their transferability is what's key. So I hope people listening walk away with the sense that whatever tools you're using, if you are elevating the method and the like engagement and the richness of conversation, that is what you're giving your kids that is irreplaceable. And any choices you make, analog, technological, synchronous, asynchronous, if your end goal is that elevation, you're doing the Lord's work.
And I'll add on to that with this unprompted last word. I've got 2 words, of course, I have to break the rules. Dive in, just do it, just try something, because the worst that's going to come out of it is that it flops, and you and your students get to have a really great conversation about why it flopped and what needs to be improved. So, and that's worst case scenario, and I think that's a fantastic place to end up. So pick something, anything, and just dive in and try it. And you will eventually find your one true loves, like I did with Parlay. So just try it.
Well, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, and I greatly appreciate you both being a part of it. If anyone watching has any questions or they want a thinking partner on any of these strategies, don't be afraid to reach out and contact us. I will make sure to have all of our contacts along with a few extra links here in just the last portion of the video. But once again, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. I really appreciated Kate and Jonathan taking some time out today to talk to me about how they're using classroom discussions and how they're making them more valuable in their classroom. The rest of this video is just going to be a quick overview on the resources that we talked about and giving you some links if you are interested in working with some of those resources yourself. Down at the bottom of this page is the bit.ly link to this presentation, but there's also a PDF version down in the description as well. One of the biggest resources that was discussed is Parlay. I have a few videos here on how Parlay is used in classroom discussions, how those discussions can be either synchronous or asynchronous depending on your format. Jonathan mentioned some STEAM discussion resources. Here's a few blogs that talk about it, along with a few ideas and strategies that you can use to make those even more valuable in your classroom. Padlet is a resource that I actually talked about last week a little bit in my video, but here's a great series of slide resources from Kate on how you can use Padlet in your classroom. And Flipgrid, which is now called Flip, also has some great resources here from Kate, along with her contact information at the bottom. Please do not worry about contacting any of us directly with any of these questions. We would love to be as helpful as we possibly can. I would also like to make one last plug to the MLTI YouTube channel, where there's lots of other videos and resources that have contact hours attached to them, along with my video from last week that began this conversation on how we can increase classroom discussions as a means of increasing student engagement in our classroom. And finally, there is my information on the left if you wanted to either call me or email me. But I greatly appreciated anyone who watched any of my videos over the last 4 weeks. I greatly appreciated the opportunity to share this content with you, and I look forward to more opportunities to help you create innovative lessons in your classroom. Thanks, everybody.